Mr. Chairman, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the ranking member. I rise today to discuss the next installment of Republican hypocrisy, the 118th Congress. This one relates to anti-Semitism. My Republican colleagues have spent months haranguing university presidents for failing to protect Jewish students on college campuses. And on this, I agree. Many university presidents have failed to show the appropriate moral clarity and leadership. But let me ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, does the removal of a university president actually change the facts on the ground? Does it make Jewish students safer? The answer is unequivocally no, certainly not in the near term. I have spoken to Jewish students all around the country, and they remain scared and afraid as anti-Semitic encampments and protests have grown more threatening and even violent. And despite all their lip service about combating anti-Semitism, this Republican bill makes it significantly more difficult for universities to keep Jewish students safe. Under the guise of ending wokeness on college campuses, this bill would strip universities of their ability to enforce reasonable restrictions on campus protests. It limits time, place, and manner restrictions and allows for no-notice, spontaneous protests, including anywhere on campus, such as Hillel's. That's right. The bill makes it easier for agitators and others to come on college campuses and engage in anti-Semitic protests or encampments. Once again, all talk, no action from my Republican colleagues. The most effective way for the federal government to combat anti-Semitism on campus is through the enforcement of the Title VI anti-discrimination law by the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, which requires universities to remedy any violations that make Jewish students or any other students unable to safely and securely get the education that they deserve. Since October 7th, OCR has opened more than 150 investigations into campus anti-Semitism, but they don't have anywhere near the resources to fully pursue those investigations. Now, never mind that Donald Trump's Project 2025 wants to eliminate the Department of Education altogether, including the Office of Civil Rights. But if Republicans truly cared, as they say, about Jewish students, they would support my Showing Up for Students Act, which would increase funding for OCR so that we can actually combat anti-Semitism on the ground at universities around the country. Yet not a single Republican has co-sponsored this bill. Not one. Instead, in the last budget, Republicans...
Give the gentleman an additional minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
Instead, in the last budget, Republicans insisted on cutting funding for OCR, further hampering OCR's ability to fight anti-Semitism. So I once again ask of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, stop using anti-Semitism as a political weapon and join us to actually solve the problem. If you care about anti-Semitism on college campuses, you must oppose H.R. 3724 and instead join my Showing Up for Students Act so Congress can be part of the solution, not the problem. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
We're on the brink of yet another government shutdown brought to you by MAGA Republicans. I've lost track of how many times this has happened in this Congress, and frankly, I and the rest of America are just tired. We're exhausted. There are real consequences when the government shuts down. It harms our national security, it harms our economy, and it harms service members, veterans, retirees, and vulnerable communities. So instead of working to prevent a shutdown, we're debating a bill that seeks to divide America with fake culture wars that are really about denying the real dangers posed by climate change and denying the fact that our country's rich diversity is one of our greatest resources. This bill, H.R. 4790, which I'm calling the Promoting MAGA Priorities Over Economic Growth Act, is straight out of the Republicans' Project 2025 playbook. It would restrict voting rights for investors, ban information that MAGA Republicans don't agree with, block the government agency responsible for protecting our capital markets, the Securities and Exchange Commission, from directing public companies to report critical information that impacts their bottom line, including climate risk, company diversity, and employee welfare. This bill flies in the face of the 80% of investors who want companies to disclose these metrics, known as environmental, social, and governance, or ESG policies. Companies that prioritize these metrics perform better financially than their peers that do not. Many studies have shown that companies that embrace the diversity of the United States outperform those that do not. Indeed, companies with the highest percentages of women board directors outperform those with the least by 53% when it comes to shareholder returns. But if we think about it, this is just common sense. When a company includes the views and perspectives that reflect the diversity of America, all of America is likely to see the value of that company. Now, when I was chairwoman of the committee, I created the first of its kind subcommittee on diversity and inclusion. We received countless hours of testimony from researchers who confirmed that embracing diversity and inclusion is not just the right thing to do, it is also good for the bottom line. It's good management. So let me go through in more detail what this bill does. First, H.R. 4790 strips American investors of their legal right to vote on and offer proposals that can influence the direction of the companies they own, particularly those related to ESG policies. The bill does this by giving management, rather than the SEC, the final say on whether a proposal gets included on the ballot at a company's annual shareholder meeting, and not just ESG proposals. The effect of this bill would deprive investors of what is today, right now, a legal right to have proposals of any kind included. There's a long history of shareholders pushing America's corporations to adopt practices that most of us take for granted today. This includes majority independent boards, say on pay, executive compensation, and annual director elections. Today, investors are pushing companies to report ESG metrics, board diversity, and how workers are treated. Being able to offer and then vote on these proposals is a legal right of investors under current law. That's right. Shareholders are the legal owners of the companies they invest in, and corporate executives work at their pleasure. Mr. Speaker, it seems that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are so concerned about socialism might need a refresher about how capitalism really works. Second, H.R. 4790 undermines other critical components of our equity markets. The bill limits independent analysis and research by impeding key providers that invest use known as proxy advisors. Proxy advisors are neutral third parties that provide shareholders and their representatives with independent analysis about items that are up for a vote on the corporate ballot. Proxy advisors also solve an important problem by doing the research on thousands of corporate votes that investors would otherwise have to do themselves. Management simply does not want ordinary investors to have this information, or it may not align with their recommendations. So to be clear, investors pay for these services and do so because they don't just want to take management's word, and they shouldn't. By restricting what analysis and research ordinary investors can purchase and use, H.R. 4790 is effectively another MAGA book ban. Third, H.R. 4790 severely limits the SEC's authority to direct companies to report data about their climate risk, diversity hiring, and employee welfare. Instead of allowing the SEC to determine what information investors should see, it is currently settled law under this bill. Under this bill, companies themselves would make this determination. It shouldn't surprise anyone that a company management is not inclined to share more than it has to. And if it gets too close, they can imagine that companies wouldn't share much of anything. Congress authorized the SEC to be the arbiter of what is disclosed because our markets only work when investors have sufficient information to make informed investment decisions. Finally, H.R. 4790 undermines the government's ability to coordinate with international partners and take common sense steps to address financial risk like those posed by climate change. In fact, if the Federal Reserve hears from a European counterpart that requiring companies to guard against wildfire risk is important, the Fed would have to jump through several new hurdles before it could implement it, even in an emergency. This extreme measure would even make it harder for bank regulators to encourage banks to expand small business lending, an issue I tried to fix through an amendment that was blocked. To be clear, this bill doesn't just have one or two poison pills in it. When each bill was separately considered in committee, not a single Democratic member voted for it. H.R. 4790 strips the right of investors to vote and offer their own proposals to strengthen the companies they own, strip their access to independent research and analysis about the companies they own, and strips the government regulator of its authority to compel these companies to provide the market with critical information. Is this America? I yield back the balance of my... I will reserve the balance of my...
The gentlewoman from